Hello, I'm Howard Husick, Vice President for Research and Publications at the Manhattan Institute. And I'm joined today by Oren Cass, Senior Fellow at the Institute and the author of the new, widely acclaimed book, The Once and Future Worker. How did we come to de-emphasize the importance of a job?
I think the shift that has happened in our culture and in our economic policy is maybe in the 1960s, and since then we came to focus almost entirely on people as consumers. We said consumer welfare is what we care about. Having more stuff, having cheaper stuff is how we measure success. And we want living standards to rise. And in those terms, we succeeded. In fact, people do have more and cheaper stuff and higher living standards than ever. But what we really missed by focusing solely on that was the work side, the side that I think is really actually more important to people in their own life satisfaction, for their families, for their communities, for our economy, which is actually having people be productive workers who can be contributing to their communities and who can be supporting themselves and their families.
Life satisfaction is an interesting term. What do you mean by that?
Well, there are a lot of ways to measure it. We know that having work, being gainfully employed, whether that's in the marketplace or in your own life in some way, is closely tied to mental health, is closely tied to self-esteem. They do studies where they ask people about their life satisfaction and look at how that changes over time. And one of the most interesting findings is that people have some pretty much preset level, and they return to it almost regardless of what happens. Births, deaths, marriage, divorce, even permanent disability. You'll typically return back to whatever your baseline level of happiness is. The only exception they've found is unemployment. People never get used to not having work. They move to a permanently lower level of satisfaction. And we see that in our society today. The growing share, especially of men, who are of the age to be working but are not in the labor force, report much lower levels of life satisfaction than people who are working.
The ground zero for that problem, I think, in the public imagination has been the small industrial city, perhaps in the Midwest, that lost its factory. Janesville, Wisconsin, there was an important book written about losing its General Motors plant. What could we have done differently that might have spared those towns, those closings, or should we think about it that way?
Well, I think we should ask that question. The reality is we can't go back and do it differently, but we can learn the lessons from it so that we do things differently in the future. And we can also ask, why isn't some of that activity coming back? You know, the mills of early 20th century Lowell aren't going to fire back up, but there's plenty of very high-tech, highly skilled manufacturing that's gone away as well. So, and why did that leave? Why isn't America a great place to do that? And I think there are a bunch of different answers to that question, and the book tries to walk through those. So from one side, why have we created an economic environment that doesn't encourage that kind of investment? We've created a situation where financial investment, technological investment, those are really appealing and attractive ways to generate a lot of profit. Actually trying to build something big in the physical world, use a lot of labor, is a really unattractive way to make money. And so unsurprisingly, all the investment flowed to the former. We've taken the attitude, for instance, with our environmental regulations that say we're going to give the environment absolute priority. So if we have a trade-off between how clean the air is and how many industrial facilities we can have, clean air comes first. And we've done the same with all of our environmental reviews, 8-10 years of review before you can do a lot of things, rather than what a lot of countries do, which say 6 months, 2 years at the latest. Now, you can get really great environmental protection that way, but you lose something too. And if you care about what you're losing, if you care about those workers, then you have to rebalance.
The issue of work does arise every now and then in political discourse, often in terms of our social policy, welfare to work, that sort of thing. We have a new Congress coming in after January. On the table, for instance, would be whether work requirements should be attached to food stamp benefits. Is that a good idea? Is that a good way to emphasize work? Or if you could suggest something to the new Congress that would be in line with the way of thinking that you're emphasizing, what would that be?
So I think that the most important place to focus is on the labor market as a market. And it works very efficiently as a market, but the outcomes it's giving are not ones that should be socially acceptable to us. We're getting efficient outcomes that aren't ones that have enough good work for everybody to do. And so we need to change the conditions that the labor market is operating in. And so we talked a little bit about the regulatory side. I think something that has a lot of potential for bipartisan engagement and engagement with the Trump administration is education. We have a lot more focus now on vocational education. People are talking about it. But we need to go the next step and as we were saying a moment ago, talk about trade-offs. Talk about what actually we've done wrong and that we're going to have to fix. And there, a big piece of it is our emphasis on college. College is fantastic for people who are going to succeed in college. But we know that a huge share of the population is not going to succeed in college. In fact, most Americans still don't earn even a community college degree. And yet, all of our focus on education reform, all of our subsidies, $100 billion a year, all goes to people who are in college on that track. And one place I think both sides would ideally come together and recognizes everyone's interest is to say we need to invest just as much. Frankly, we need to have more focus on what another track looks like, on how we help people who aren't headed for a college degree still develop skills and prepare to be productive workers, not just people who are going to benefit as consumers from the work that someone else is doing.
Okay, my guest has been Oren Cass, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the author of the new book, The Once and Future Worker. Thank you so much, Oren.
Thank you.